Hi, Year 12. It's Mr. Ozparty. This is the first video I'm doing for the Microsoft Teams work that we're doing now that we're not at school at the moment. And it's about Aristotle. So it's a bit unfortunate that when we left, when class was finished, we weren't at the end of a unit. So we're kind of like finishing off a unit here. But I'm just going to talk through how you might evaluate Aristotle, how you might put this stuff into an essay, and then I'll talk about what tasks I want you to do separately. I'll put that on the Microsoft Teams. I'll type something up about it. So to evaluate Aristotle, the sort of essays you might get asked about Aristotle are, one most likely thing is something about the four causes, whether the four causes are an accurate description of reality, something like that. So is it a good theory? You could get asked a question directly about the prime mover, and we did something in class about the prime mover and what it is and the arguments for and against. I don't want us to look at essays about the prime mover yet, though. In fact, I want to wait until we've done other stuff in philosophy and then come back to the prime mover, because to evaluate the prime mover, it's useful to know something about some of the other arguments for and against the existence of God, and you can kind of link those into what Aristotle says. So for the time being, I just want to look at kind of overall evaluating Aristotle's theory of the four causes. So that is the idea that all things in the universe, in the world, have these four causes. That is the material cause, that's what they're made out of. The efficient cause, that is the process by which they came to be what they are. The formal cause, which is the form or shape into which they're formed, and then the things they're able to do, the functions they're able to carry out based on that shape, and then the final cause, which is the purpose, or the telos or goal of that thing. So Aristotle's idea is that the best way to explain things in the universe is to understand what their four different causes are. Now, the tricky thing about evaluating Aristotle is it's quite difficult to do this essay just directly on Aristotle. So the best way to do it is to make a comparison to Plato. The reason I say that is because most people want to argue that Aristotle's first three causes are quite good, but the final cause isn't so good, and we'll look at why that is in a minute. But if you just say the first three causes are good, the problem is that the first three causes really don't say that much, or that's not that much to say about them. If you can say why the first three causes are better than Plato's theories of forms, then that makes for a stronger essay. And you might think, well, why are we comparing to Plato anyway? Well, the point is that Plato was Aristotle's teacher, and Aristotle's theory of the four causes was like a response to Plato's theory of forms. So in evaluating it, a good way to evaluate it is to say, well, was it better than the thing that it tried to respond to? Or was it actually better than the theory of forms? Okay, before we get to that, let's just have a look at this notion of the final cause, because we basically looked already at comparing Plato and Aristotle and why we might want to see Aristotle's theory as better than Plato's. But I really think that most of the arguments we've looked at so far are really relevant to the first three causes, to the idea of material, efficient, and formal cause. It's more complicated when you get to the final cause, and I'm going to put something on the board, on the slides, which will help to illustrate this. So here's a question: what is the final cause of a stick? What is the purpose or telos of a stick? Now, the whole point in a class, we would go through a series of suggestions what it might be. You can use a stick for hitting someone with, or you can use it for what else can you use it for? I suppose in the old days you could use it for helping you walk if you've got a bad leg. You could use it for making music with, some kind of drum, hitting a drum with it. You can use it for lots of different things, right? You can use it for throwing for a dog to catch and all this kind of stuff. A dog to fetch, sorry. All those kind of things could be the purpose of a stick, but the problem is that none of those are really the purpose of a stick. Most people would argue that there is no real purpose for a stick. There's lots of purposes that we can give things, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily have a purpose. We might say, well, for me, the purpose of a stick is to help me walk with. If you've got a bad leg, you might say, well, It's really useful to help me walk. But that doesn't seem to be what the purpose of a stick is. That seems to just be how you've used it. And so the point I'm trying to get across with this example is to say, well, is it actually true that all things have a purpose, have a telos? Maybe most things are they just are, and they don't have any telos. There's no purpose that they were designed in aid of. So let's have a look at these arguments. I've put these arguments on the Microsoft Teams. All the different arguments for evaluating Plato are in a series of slides that I've put on the Microsoft Teams page. So you can download that, or you can just look at them here, pause the slides. So here I've got, is Aristotle's teleological understanding of the world plausible? And I've got some arguments for yes and some arguments for no. So I've put first for yes. It is true that many parts of the world appear to have a purpose. For example, the human eye seems to have the purpose of seeing, while the wings of a bird seem to have the purpose of flight. When you look at those things, it seems obvious that they are made for that purpose. Otherwise, we'll see there's some problem here. There's some problems with that idea. Secondly, the apparent purpose found in natural things is the basis for William Paley's design argument. Paley argued that the fact that many things in the world are complex and seem to be designed for a purpose proves there must be a designer God. So that's the basic strength of Aristotle's ideas, is some things just seem clearly to have a purpose. A bird's wing and a human eye are great examples because, if you think of a bird's wing, you think, well, it's clearly designed for the purpose of it's clearly got the purpose of flying, and an eye has clearly got the purpose of seeing things. However, let's have a look at the problems here, the no column. So for number one, the idea that things in the natural world have a specific purpose or telos can be questioned. Richard Dawkins argues that the apparent purpose found in nature can be explained through Darwinian natural selection. This means that, for example, the human eye developed because of genetic mutations which happened to help humans to survive, not because the eye has a specific purpose or telos. So the point here is not that the eye doesn't help us to see; it does help us to see, but it's not got that purpose or telos in itself. It wasn't created, Dawkins says, with that in mind. So for Aristotle to be right, the whole point of the eye has to be to help us to see. But what Dawkins is saying is no. The eye developed through a series of chances, genetic mutations, and then some of them just happened to be useful to us. So the ones the genetic mutations that were useful to human beings survived. So that would mean that the eye doesn't have a telos. There is no purpose to the eye. It just happens to have been the thought of thing that helps us to see, and that's been useful to us. But it's not there in itself designed to help us see. I hope that makes sense, because it is a bit of a difficult point to explain. Okay, second, it can be argued that only things that humans design have a purpose. Even then, inanimate objects only have a purpose when humans give them one. So there's 2 points in here, right? One is, maybe there are things that have a purpose, but they're only things that we design. So, a cup has a purpose because we have made it specifically to hold water in. A chair has a purpose because we have made it to sit on. Whereas like a cow or like a bird's wing, they're just there. They haven't got a purpose. Even things that we have designed, we could say, well, do they have a purpose in themselves? We think they have a purpose. We put the chair together in the shape of a chair, and we say the purpose is to sit on. But the chair in itself is an inanimate object. It doesn't have any thoughts. It doesn't have any feelings. So to itself, it has no purpose. It just is there. So maybe the whole idea of purpose is wrong. Number three, the idea that humans have a specific purpose can also be questioned. So this is the idea of eudaimonia. So Aristotle says that we have the purpose of eudaimonia. Aristotle argues that because each part of the body has a purpose, humans must have a purpose. So this is how Aristotle argues. He says, look, every part of our body, our eyes, our feet, our hands, they all have seem to be designed with some purpose. And he says, well, if every part of our body is designed with a purpose, surely we must have a purpose. However, this commits a fallacy. A fallacy is a mistake in logical reasoning. A fallacy is a problem with your argument. I think we looked at a fallacy already. Did we look at a fallacy? I can't remember. Anyway, the fallacy of composition is to say that some people will say that just because every part of something has a certain quality, then they make the leap to saying the whole thing must have that quality. And that's a fallacy that doesn't actually work. Just because, even if it was true that every part of a human being had a purpose, that wouldn't make it necessarily true that the whole of a human being had a purpose. So Aristotle's argument there doesn't really work. Number 4, philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, that's a French name, and Jean-Paul Sartre have argued that there is no purpose in the universe, and particularly in human life. Purpose is something that humans give to things. We get to decide ourselves what the purpose of our lives is. There is no set purpose for human lives or for anything in the universe. So that is what you'd call an existentialist point of view, and that is the idea, there is no purpose built into the universe. Things, people do not have a purpose. It's for us to give things purpose. Now, if you look at all those arguments, obviously you can't use all those arguments in a essay, but you probably could combine a couple of the arguments in the no column to make a good case to say that Aristotle is mistaken here. There's actually one argument that I haven't put in here, and that is that there are some philosophers in the world today who believe that everything has a purpose, but they tend to be theists. They tend to be people who believe in God, because if you think about it, the idea that if things have got a purpose, then that would seem to suggest that there's someone who's made them to give them that purpose. That is the whole basis of William Paley's design argument. However, Aristotle is not a theist. He doesn't believe that there's a designer. He believes in this thing called the prime mover, but he doesn't believe that someone's designed everything with a purpose. So you could say that even if you believed in everything having a purpose, his teleological understanding of the world, you could say, well, it just doesn't make sense in terms of it just doesn't make sense in terms of his own philosophy, because he doesn't believe in a designer God, but he believes in purpose. You could say, well, yes, you could agree with that everything's got a purpose, but disagree with Aristotle's idea about how that purpose came to be. That kind of thing. That makes sense. Okay, so yeah, I would suggest, and most times when I've taught this, people have tended to criticize Aristotle on this point and be against the idea of the teleological understanding of the world is plausible. And I would say, if you were going to do a peril on that kind of thing, you would start off with the pluses, and you could probably put both of those yeses into one peril, and then do a couple on the other side. You could talk about evolution. You could talk about the fact that purpose is something that we give to things in the universe. It's not something they have in themselves. That kind of stuff. Okay, so that will be part of your essay. I'm going to talk through how you do a structured essay plan, this will be the rest of the essay will basically be based on this. So I'll talk about how the structure would go, but your other part of your essay would be to compare Plato with Aristotle, and here you'd be comparing the first three causes with Plato's theory of forms. So people tend to, in essays, argue for Aristotle on this one. So people tend to go down the route of saying the first three causes are good, and they're certainly better than Plato, but the fourth cause is not so good. So let's have a quick look at the arguments between Aristotle and Plato. So here's arguments to say that Aristotle is better than Plato. Aristotle can better explain change than Plato. Plato was not interested in change in the world. He wanted to understand the essence of things and saw the changing nature of the world as of no interest to philosophers. Aristotle, on the other hand, embraces that the world is changing and explores why it happens. That's a positive for Aristotle. If you look at things like the efficient cause, that very much can help to explain how did things come to be, what was the process but they came to be, whereas Plato's theory of forms just doesn't really have to understand change at all. Secondly, Aristotle's philosophy is therefore more practical and Plato has more use in the everyday world of senses. So yeah, again, it seems to, because it takes seriously change in the world of the senses, and that's what it focuses on, it has more practical application, whereas Plato doesn't really care about the world of senses, or the world, what he calls the world of appearances, and therefore it could be seen that on a practical level his philosophy is not very important. Although Plato would challenge that, because he thinks that for example in the world of ethics, you need to know about the form of the good to really be able to be a good person in everyday life. So Plato would challenge that in that way. He would say that actually if you know about the forms, then you're going to be a more practically useful person in the world of appearances. Third, and probably the most important one, Aristotle's concepts of material, efficient and formal causes of things are more accessible and intuitive than Plato's theory of forms. These causes provide explanations of the nature of things in the world which are grounded in empirical observations, unlike Plato's forms. So this is in a way helps to understand why most people quite like these three causes, but why there's not that much to say about them if you don't compare them to Plato. Because think about them. Firstly, material cause. Everything is made out of something. Yes, that's true, but that's obvious. Efficient cause, everything is made by some process. Well, that is true, and but then it's quite obvious. Formal cause, everything's in a particular shape, and because of that shape, they can carry out particular functions. Well, that's true too, but again, is it just stating the obvious about things? But what's good about these ideas, in comparison to Plato, is that they seem more, one, intuitively true. It just seems obvious to people that that's true. But secondly, they're grounded in empirical observation. You can see that they're true. Whereas obviously with Plato, you cannot see that the world of forms is true. Now that is not enough, probably, to dismiss Plato, because we've seen before, you can't just say, oh, Plato's got no empirical proof. You've got to challenge Plato's basic arguments for the forms. Let's look at the arguments for Plato. So, while it's appealing to many, particularly today, Aristotle's belief that all knowledge comes from sense experience cannot be proven. Plato may be right that there is a world of forms. There may be ways in which we know things other than through the senses, such as reason, as Plato believes. So this is a good point, right? Just because there's no empirical evidence for the forms, just because Aristotle's theory is more empirically verifiable, that doesn't necessarily mean it's necessarily true, or that Plato is necessarily wrong. There could be other ways of knowing things. Secondly, a follower of Plato could argue that we need the theory of forms to fully understand the world. Studying lots of examples of particulars in the world will not help us to understand what the essence of things like beauty and goodness are. If we cannot get definite knowledge of these things in the world of appearances, we must look to the world of forms. This is basically what we call the one over many argument. This is Plato's main argument for belief in the forms. There are lots of things that are, for example, good or beautiful in the world, and therefore there must be a form of goodness and a form of beauty which explain why these things, which are different, all can be labelled in this particular way as good or beautiful. So those are the arguments for and against. Now I'm going to talk about how you might put this into an essay. Okay, so this is the best thing here would be to take notes as we go through on this, because I'm not going to put the whole thing on the board. So here's a typical essay question. Aristotle's theory of the four causes explains nothing. So it's in the negative, it's saying it's not a good theory. Your task is basically to evaluate. Is that true? Does it help us to explain things or not? So here's how the intro might work. So you'd begin by defining what it is, his theory of the four causes. You briefly explain what the four causes are. I would say something about in comparison to Plato there, because that will help to set up why you're doing a comparison to Plato later. So I'd say, this is in contrast to Aristotle's teacher, Plato, who explained the existence of things, explained the nature of things in the universe through his theory of forms. Implications. Well, the implications are very important because this is Aristotle's main way of understanding reality. So the implication of this is Aristotle's theory of the nature of reality accurate, helpful, or not? Scholars, we're going to compare with Plato, and you may want to look at some other scholars along the way. For example, you might take in Sartre, Dawkins, William Paley. You might look at people that we've looked at on the slides, and then obviously your conclusion is up to you. But the conclusion that people most often reach, and it's quite a nice nuanced one, is the first three causes are superior to Plato's theory of forms. The last and they're good. They're accurate. But maybe some people like to add, but maybe they don't really tell you very much that you didn't know already. But the fourth cause is more doubtful. So that's usually where people go. Is first three causes quite good, at least better than Plato, but maybe they don't tell you a lot. The fourth cause is not so good or not very accurate, so it doesn't tell us. So overall, you'd say their four causes explain something about the nature of reality, but there is also. Here's how I'd structure it in terms of a essay. So I'd begin with the first three causes, and this is where I'd make the comparison to Plato. So you could say it could be argued that Aristotle's first three causes are superior to Plato's, are a good explanation of reality, and are certainly superior to Plato's theory of the theory of forms. And then you'd go into why. I would talk about helps to extend change in a way that Plato can't, and they're empirically verifiable. In the response, then you have to talk about why Plato might be better. So you might say, you might talk about the one of many argument. You might say, Plato would have argued that actually these three causes are not enough to explain reality. You need to have this theory of forms behind it, because you need something to explain what links all things that are good or all things that are beautiful and so on in the universe. We need something in the world of forms to explain why all good things or why all beautiful things have this thing in common. Then in your evaluation, then you have to say who's right, and the best way to do that would be to look at one of the criticisms of Plato to say, well, actually Plato is guilty of reification when he thinks that we need a form of beauty or of goodness. He is making a concrete thing that really exists out of what is really just an abstract idea. We find lots of different things beautiful. So I would say you give the arguments for Aristotle, you give up Plato's argument, you say why Plato is wrong, and then you link back and saying, therefore, the three causes are better than the theory of forms. Second peril. Now you might only do two perils in this. As you can see, the perils are quite involved, so you might only do two perils, or I am going to give you an optional peril at the end. Then you talk about the final cause, right? So you just go through the points and say, well, some people would argue that the final cause is also an helpful way to look at reality. It helps us to explain the nature of reality. You talk about what the final cause is, and then you look at the arguments. You look at the fact that many things in the universe look like they've got a cause. The bird's wing, the human eye, you make that link with Paley. And then you look at the criticisms. Evolution explains the bird's wing. It's not to do with it having a telos. It's not to do with having a purpose. It's just to do with it happened to evolve randomly in that way. You look at Dawkins there. You look at the idea that things that are designed by a human being have a purpose, not things that are just there. They don't have a purpose. So it's only things that are designed by human beings. With things that are not designed, we are giving them that purpose. And you could move on to look at Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre. The universe in itself has no meaning or purpose. We give it a purpose. Human beings have no purpose or telos. We give ourselves that purpose. So that kind of idea. So then you're showing, actually, Aristotle seems to be wrong. You could even mention that point that Aristotle's ideas of a final cause or a purpose to everything would make sense if there was a creator God who gave things that purpose, but Aristotle doesn't believe in that creator God. Possible peril 3. So you could look at the prime mover. You could, because basically the prime mover is part of the theory of forms to some extent. That the prime mover is the final cause of the universe. So the idea that everything moves towards its final cause. So if you wanted to, you could put a third peril in where you just looked at the arguments for and against the prime mover. You could look at the fact that, Aristotle says there must be a prime mover because there has to be a cause of all change and motion in the universe. He doesn't think there can be an infinite regress of causes going back and back forever. So there must be some ultimate cause, and that cause is what he calls the prime mover, that kind of draws everything, all change, towards it. And that's easy to criticize because you can say, well, hold on, the Big Bang Theory proves that we actually don't need a telos, a final cause of the universe. We need an efficient cause of the universe, and so that would be like a god rather than a prime mover. And you could also, or you could say that, well, it's really difficult to understand how a being like the prime mover, which is supposed to be non-physical, can explain change in the physical world. There doesn't seem to be any way to understand that. Okay, that is everything, I think, on Aristotle. Hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions, please put them in the Teams and I'll try and answer them. Okay, bye.